Sometimes the calmest person in the room is the one who has already survived the storm. That was the thought that would later replay in Daniel Whitmore's mind again and again, long after that evening had ended, long after the headlines and the interviews and the stunned conversations. But at that moment, none of that existed yet. All Daniel Whitmore noticed was a waitress who refused to panic. The restaurant glowed with warm amber light, the kind that made Manhattan's winter evenings feel softer than they really were. Outside, the city moved with its usual restless rhythm. Yellow taxis sliding past streetlights, steam rising from subway grates, people in dark coats walking quickly through the cold air. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Crystal glasses caught the light above white linen tables. It was the sort of place where deals were whispered and fortunes quietly shifted over dinner. Daniel Whitmore sat near the center of the room, his tailored navy suit perfectly pressed, his silver watch reflecting the chandelier above. At 38, he was known across Wall Street as the man who could see opportunity where others saw risk. Investors trusted him. Competitors feared him. And tonight, like most nights, he was used to being the most important person in the room. He barely noticed the waitress who approached his table. Emily Carter carried a tray with steady hands, her dark blonde hair tied back neatly, her expression calm and professional. She set down a glass of sparkling water beside him. "Your water, sir." Daniel gave a brief nod without looking up from his phone. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was habit. In his world, waitstaff blended into the background like furniture or lighting, present, useful, but rarely seen. Emily simply acknowledged the nod and stepped away, moving through the restaurant with quiet efficiency. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and checked on guests with a composure that seemed almost unusual for someone working a busy dinner shift. Most people moved quickly in places like this. Emily moved carefully, observantly, as if she were always listening for something no one else could hear. 20 minutes passed. Conversations filled the room, low voices discussing venture capital, tech startups, real estate deals measured in millions of dollars. Laughter drifted across the dining floor. Silverware tapped lightly against porcelain plates. Everything felt perfectly ordinary. And then the front door opened. At first, nothing seemed strange. 3 men entered wearing heavy coats, the kind anyone might wear on a cold Manhattan night. But Emily noticed something immediately. The way their eyes moved across the room. The way their shoulders stayed tense. The way they paused just a second too long near the entrance. Most people didn't notice details like that. Emily did. Daniel Whitmore did not. He was reading a message from his assistant about a meeting scheduled the next morning. Around him, guests continued eating, talking, sipping wine. The room remained warm, elegant, predictable, until the sudden shift came. Not loud, not chaotic, just a sharp change in the air that made conversations stop mid-sentence. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as people turned their heads toward the entrance. A few quiet gasps traveled through the dining room. For most people, confusion arrived first, then fear. But Emily Carter did something different. She didn't freeze. She didn't panic. She simply set her tray down on the nearest table, lifted her eyes toward the door, and began quietly counting something no one else even realized mattered yet. 1, 2, 3. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore finally looked up from his phone. And what caught his attention wasn't the tension spreading through the restaurant. It wasn't the whispers or the uneasy silence forming around him. It was the waitress. Because while everyone else in the room looked terrified, Emily Carter looked calm. The silence inside the restaurant felt heavier now, as if the warm air had suddenly turned colder without anyone touching the thermostat. Conversations had stopped completely. Glasses rested halfway to lips. A fork slipped from someone's hand and tapped softly against a plate, the small sound echoing louder than it should have. Daniel Whitmore slowly lowered his phone onto the table. Across the room, 3 unfamiliar men stood near the entrance, their presence shifting the mood of the entire space without a single raised voice. It was the kind of tension that traveled through a crowd like an invisible current. Daniel had spent his life reading rooms filled with investors and executives. He could sense pressure in a negotiation before anyone said a word. But this was different. This was something deeper, something instinctive that made the human mind recognize that the rules of a normal evening had suddenly changed. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. A couple near the window quietly slid their chairs. closer together. The manager behind the bar paused mid-step, watching carefully. No one seemed to know what to do next. Everyone except one person. Emily Carter stood beside a nearby table where she had placed her tray. Her hands rested lightly on the polished wood surface, steady and relaxed. Her breathing did not change. Her posture did not tighten. She simply observed. One of the men near the entrance scanned the dining room slowly, his eyes moving from table to table. The second man stood slightly behind him, adjusting the sleeve of his coat, as if he were trying to appear ordinary. The third remained closer to the door, quietly watching the street outside through the glass. Small details. Most people never notice small details when they felt afraid. Emily noticed everything. Daniel noticed her. That was what confused him the most. People around him had begun whispering nervously. A woman 2 tables away leaned toward her husband, her voice barely audible as she asked what was happening. The bartender slowly set down a bottle he had been holding. Even the soft jazz playing through the speakers seemed quieter now, like background music that did not realize the scene had changed. But Emily Carter looked exactly the same as she had 5 minutes earlier. Calm, focused, present. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly, studying her. He had built an entire career on recognizing patterns in human behavior. Investors panicked when markets dipped. Competitors hesitated when pressure increased. Fear always showed itself in predictable ways. Except here. Except with her. Emily lifted her gaze again toward the 3 men near the entrance. And in that brief moment Daniel noticed something unusual. She was counting. Her lips did not move, but her eyes shifted in small precise movements as if she were measuring distance or time. One glance. Another. Then a quiet breath. Daniel felt a strange curiosity rising inside him. Who was this waitress? Because whatever was unfolding in the room, she was not reacting like someone caught by surprise. She was reacting like someone who had already seen this kind of moment before. Near the entrance, the first man finally stepped farther into the dining room, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the room in a tone that carried easily across the quiet tables. No one needed to raise their voice. The tension was already doing that work. Chairs shifted slightly. A few guests slowly stood as if unsure whether they should leave or remain seated. The uncertainty made the air feel thick. Daniel instinctively straightened in his chair. His mind was already calculating possibilities. But before he could fully process the situation, Emily Carter moved for the first time since placing down her tray. The movement was small, almost invisible. She reached for the tray again and lifted it gently into her hands. Then she turned slightly toward Daniel Whitmore and spoke in a voice so calm that for a moment he thought he might have imagined it. "Sir," she said quietly, without looking directly at him, "when the tray falls, please move 1 step to your left." Daniel blinked in confusion. He looked up at her fully now, searching her expression for some sign of panic or uncertainty. There was none, only calm focus. And that was the moment Daniel Whitmore realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The calmest person in the entire restaurant was not the billionaire at the center table. It was the waitress standing beside him. Daniel Whitmore stared at the waitress for a moment, trying to understand what she had just said. Her voice had been quiet, almost casual, as if she were simply reminding him about the dessert menu. But the words themselves made no sense in the middle of a room filled with tension. "When the tray falls, please move 1 step to your left." Daniel felt a flicker of irritation mixed with confusion. He had spent his entire career surrounded by people who carefully measured every word when speaking to him. Assistants rehearsed sentences. Executives chose phrases cautiously. Yet this waitress had just given him an instruction as if she were the one in control of the situation. He studied her face, expecting to find uncertainty or fear. Instead, he saw something else entirely. Focus. Emily Carter's eyes were not on him anymore. They were back on the 3 men near the entrance. Her gaze moved with quiet precision from one person to the next, observing small details that most people in the room were too nervous to notice. The first man continued speaking calmly to the room, asking everyone to remain where they were and to stay quiet. His tone was controlled, almost polite, but the message was clear enough to make the entire dining room hold its breath. Several guests slowly raised their hands as if to show they meant no trouble. Others sat completely still, unsure what the right reaction should be. The manager behind the bar nodded carefully and stepped away from the register. No one wanted to make the situation worse. Daniel Whitmore felt his pulse beginning to quicken. He was used to controlling situations, not sitting in the middle of uncertainty while strangers gave instructions. His instinct told him to stand up, to speak, to assert the same authority that worked in every boardroom he had ever entered. But something stopped him. His eyes drifted back to Emily. She had not moved. The tray remained balanced lightly in her hands. The overhead chandelier reflected softly against the polished metal surface. Daniel suddenly realized she was listening. Not just watching, but listening carefully to the room around her. The shifting of chairs, the distance between footsteps, the faint sound of traffic outside the restaurant windows. It was as if she were measuring the rhythm of the moment itself. Emily quietly adjusted her grip on the tray. The movement was small enough that no one else would have noticed, but Daniel saw it because he was already looking at her. For a brief second her eyes met his again. There was no panic there, only a calm certainty that seemed strangely reassuring. Daniel leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she glanced once more toward the entrance. The three men were now spread farther into the dining room. One near the door, one halfway between the tables, one closer to the bar area. They were watching everyone carefully, but none of them were watching her. That seemed important to Emily. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely louder than the soft music still playing through the restaurant speakers. "Trust me," she said quietly. Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Trust her? He did not even know her last name until 20 minutes ago. Yet something about her composure made it difficult to dismiss her. She looked like someone who had already solved a problem everyone else had just noticed. Around them, the room remained frozen in uncertainty. Guests waited nervously. The staff stood quietly beside their stations. Time stretched in that strange way it does during moments when everyone is unsure what will happen next. Emily Carter took a slow breath. Then, without warning, she allowed the tray to slip gently from her hands. The tray slipped from Emily Carter's hands and struck the floor with a sharp metallic sound that cut through the tense silence of the restaurant. The sudden noise echoed beneath the chandelier and across the polished wood tables, startling several guests who had been sitting perfectly still for minutes. A few people flinched. Someone near the window gasped quietly. For a split second, every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward the sound. That moment was exactly what Emily had been waiting for. Daniel Whitmore barely had time to react before he felt a firm hand grip his sleeve. Emily moved quickly but smoothly, guiding him sideways just as she had instructed. One step to the left. The movement felt strange and almost unnecessary, but something in her calm certainty made Daniel follow without questioning. His chair scraped softly against the floor as he shifted. The room remained tense, yet the tray on the floor had changed the rhythm of the moment. The man closest to the dining tables glanced briefly toward the fallen tray, clearly distracted by the sudden noise. It was only a brief look, but Emily noticed it immediately. Her eyes moved again, measuring distance, angles, and the position of every person in the room. She had already counted how many tables stood between them and the kitchen hallway. She had already noticed that the service door near the back remained slightly open. Small details. Important details. Daniel leaned toward her, still confused by the strange instruction she had given him. "What is happening?" he whispered under his breath. Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she crouched slightly as if preparing to pick up the tray she had dropped. Her movements were slow and careful, the kind of motion that looked completely ordinary to anyone watching from across the room. But Daniel could feel the tension in her posture now, like a coiled spring ready to release. She spoke again without looking at him. "The kitchen door behind us is open," she said quietly. Daniel blinked, unsure why that mattered. Emily continued, her voice calm and controlled. "In about 10 seconds, the man near the entrance will look back toward the street again." Daniel glanced toward the entrance instinctively, but Emily lightly tapped the edge of the table with her finger. "Do not look," she murmured. "Just listen." Daniel swallowed and forced himself to keep his gaze down. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts with less tension than he felt sitting in that chair. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen in uneasy silence. The soft music continued playing as if unaware that the atmosphere had completely changed. Guests sat motionless, unsure whether any movement might cause trouble. Emily slowly reached down and lifted the tray from the floor. Her movements remained calm, deliberate, controlled. Then she leaned slightly closer to Daniel and spoke one more time. "When I walk toward the kitchen," she said quietly, "follow me." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. The idea sounded reckless. But before he could respond, Emily had already straightened up and turned toward the hallway leading to the kitchen area. She began walking with the same steady pace she had used all evening while serving tables. Calm, professional, almost invisible. For a moment, no one paid attention to her. And that was exactly the point. Emily Carter walked toward the kitchen hallway with the same steady rhythm she had used all evening, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral, as if she were simply returning an empty tray after clearing a table. Anyone watching from across the dining room would have seen nothing unusual. That was exactly why it worked. Daniel Whitmore hesitated for only half a second before pushing his chair back quietly and standing. His heart was beating faster now, but he forced himself to move slowly, just as she had. He had spent years in high-pressure negotiations where a single wrong reaction could cost millions of dollars. Tonight felt strangely similar, except the stakes felt far more personal. Around them, the restaurant remained tense and quiet. The guests were still seated, many of them keeping their heads lowered, unsure whether any movement might attract attention. A couple near the far wall had quietly clasped hands across the table. The bartender stood frozen behind the counter, watching carefully. The three men near the entrance continued scanning the room, but their attention remained mostly focused on the front area, where several customers had raised their hands nervously. Emily walked past two tables without breaking her pace. The tray rested lightly in her hand again, just another piece of restaurant equipment moving through the room. Daniel followed 3 steps behind her, keeping his gaze lowered just enough to appear cooperative, yet aware of everything happening around him. The hallway leading toward the kitchen grew closer with each step. From Daniel's seat earlier, it had seemed far away, but now he realized it was barely 20 feet from the center of the dining floor. Emily had measured that distance long before she ever moved. As they reached the edge of the dining area, Emily slowed slightly and leaned toward a nearby table where an older couple sat quietly. Her voice remained calm and soft. "Please stand slowly and walk toward the kitchen," she said gently. "Everything will be fine." The couple exchanged a quick glance but nodded, trusting the quiet confidence in her voice. They rose carefully from their chairs and began walking in the same direction Emily had been heading. That small movement created a subtle ripple through the room. 2 more guests at the next table followed, standing slowly and stepping toward the hallway as if it had always been the natural place to go. The men near the entrance noticed the motion but did not react immediately. From their perspective, it simply looked like a few nervous diners shifting their positions. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening. Exactly the kind of small movement that blended into the atmosphere of uncertainty already filling the room. Emily continued walking, guiding the small group toward the kitchen door that remained slightly open. Daniel felt a strange mix of disbelief and admiration building in his chest. This waitress was quietly leading people to safety without raising her voice, without causing panic, without drawing attention. She had turned the room's tension into a slow, controlled movement. As they reached the doorway, the sounds of the kitchen drifted faintly through the opening. The quiet hum of equipment, the distant clatter of dishes, familiar noises that suddenly felt comforting compared to the tense silence behind them. Emily pushed the door open a little wider and gestured for the guests to step through. One by one, they slipped into the hallway beyond the kitchen, disappearing from the dining room without commotion. Daniel paused beside the door and glanced back across the restaurant. Several other guests had begun standing now, following the same calm pattern. The room was changing, slowly and carefully, guided by one quiet waitress, who refused to panic. The kitchen hallway filled quietly as more guests stepped through the doorway one by one, their footsteps soft against the tile floor, their voices barely louder than whispers. The sudden change from the tense dining room to the familiar smell of warm bread and simmering sauces felt surreal. Stainless steel counters lined the walls. Pots rested on stovetops. A dishwasher hummed faintly in the background. It looked like any other restaurant kitchen near closing time, yet the people gathering inside knew the evening outside that doorway had suddenly become something very different. Emily Carter stood just inside the door, guiding each person forward with calm gestures. "Please keep moving," she said gently. "There is an exit at the back." Her voice never rose. She did not rush anyone. Somehow that quiet confidence kept the growing group from panicking. Daniel Whitmore stepped through the doorway after her and paused beside a large prep counter. For the first time since the tension began, he allowed himself to breathe more slowly. He glanced back toward the dining room entrance, where a few remaining guests still sat in their chairs, uncertain whether they should move or remain where they were. The distance from the kitchen door to the far tables was only about 30 feet, but it felt like a different world. Daniel turned toward Emily, still struggling to understand what he had just witnessed. "How did you know that would work?" he asked quietly. Emily was already guiding another couple through the hallway toward the rear exit. She did not answer right away. Instead, she pointed toward the back door where a young cook had begun opening it carefully, letting in a thin line of cool night air from the alley outside. One by one, the guests stepped through that door and disappeared into the safety of the quiet street behind the building. Only after the hallway cleared slightly did Emily finally look back at Daniel. For the first time since the evening began, a small hint of emotion crossed her face. Not fear, not relief, something quieter. Memory. "When people panic, they move fast," she said softly. "When people stay calm, they move together." Daniel studied her expression carefully. He had met countless professionals who claimed to stay calm under pressure. Most of them lost that composure the moment real uncertainty appeared. Emily Carter had done the opposite. She had walked directly through the center of tension and turned it into quiet order. Daniel glanced back toward the dining room again. Only a handful of guests remained now, each one slowly following the same path toward the kitchen door that Emily had created. The room that had felt frozen minutes earlier was gradually emptying without a single shout, without a single rushed movement. It felt almost impossible. He lowered his voice again. "You planned that in seconds," he said. Emily shook her head gently. "Not seconds," she replied. Her eyes moved briefly toward the dining room, as if she were still tracking every detail. "Experience." Daniel frowned slightly, curious about the word she had chosen. Experience with what? Before he could ask another question, the last two guests from the dining room stepped into the hallway behind them, guided by one of the servers who had quietly followed Emily's lead. The kitchen now held nearly everyone who had been seated in the restaurant only minutes earlier. Emily glanced toward the back door where the cool air continued drifting inside. Then she spoke again, her voice calm as ever. "Everyone needs to go outside now," she said. "Slowly. Stay together." The group began moving again, forming a quiet line toward the exit. Daniel remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching the woman who had turned a dangerous situation into something controlled and orderly, without raising her voice once. In that moment, he realized something he had never noticed before in all his years of business and power. Real authority did not always arrive in a tailored suit or behind a polished desk. Sometimes it wore a simple restaurant uniform and carried an empty tray. Cool night air greeted the guests as they stepped out through the rear door into the narrow alley behind the restaurant. The city sounded different back there. Instead of soft jazz and quiet conversations, there was the distant rumble of traffic, the hum of ventilation fans, and the occasional echo of footsteps against brick walls. One by one the diners moved away from the door, gathering along the sidewalk as they tried to understand what had just happened inside. Some wrapped their coats tighter around their shoulders. Others pulled out their phones with trembling hands, calling family members or quietly explaining that they were safe. Daniel Whitmore stepped out last, the cold air brushing against his face as he looked back toward the kitchen doorway. Emily Carter remained just inside, making sure everyone had passed through safely. She counted quickly with her eyes, scanning the group outside. 23 guests. 5 staff members. Everyone who had been in the dining room was now standing in the alley behind the building. Only after confirming that did she finally step outside herself. The back door closed gently behind her. Daniel watched her closely. The tension that had filled the restaurant minutes earlier was slowly dissolving into relief and quiet conversation. Yet Emily did not celebrate or draw attention to herself. She simply leaned lightly against the brick wall beside the door, catching a slow breath of the cold air. A young couple approached her first, their voices filled with gratitude. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "You helped everyone stay calm." Emily nodded politely, offering a small reassuring smile. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she replied. "You stayed together." More guests began thanking her as well, each person speaking quietly, as if they had just shared an unusual secret. Daniel remained a few steps away, watching the scene unfold with growing curiosity. In his world, people often rushed toward recognition. Success usually arrived with attention, cameras, interviews. Yet Emily Carter seemed completely uninterested in any spotlight. When the final cook stepped outside and confirmed that the kitchen was empty, Emily finally relaxed her shoulders slightly. Daniel stepped closer. "You handled that better than anyone I have ever seen," he said honestly. Emily looked at him for a moment, studying his expression as if she were deciding whether the compliment mattered. Then she gave a small shrug. "People are safer when someone stays calm," she replied. Daniel shook his head slightly, still trying to understand her. Most people would have panicked. Emily glanced down the alley toward the quiet streetlights at the end of the block. For a moment her expression changed again, the same distant memory crossing her face that Daniel had noticed earlier in the kitchen. "Most people have not been in rooms where panic makes things worse," she said quietly. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What kind of rooms?" he asked. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked back toward the restaurant building where the warm light from the kitchen windows still glowed faintly against the night air. Somewhere inside, the tension that had filled the dining room was fading. Outside, the group of guests stood together in quiet relief. Emily finally spoke again, her voice calm and thoughtful. "The kind where staying calm is the only way everyone walks out safely," she said. Daniel Whitmore studied her carefully, realizing that the quiet waitress he had ignored earlier that evening carried far more experience than her simple uniform suggested. The group remained gathered in the quiet alley behind the restaurant, their breath faintly visible in the cool Manhattan night. The tension that had gripped the dining room only minutes earlier was slowly giving way to relief. People spoke in hushed voices, replaying the strange chain of events that had guided them safely out of the building. A few guests stood beneath the soft glow of a streetlight, calling friends or family members to reassure them that everything was fine. Others simply stood together in silence, still processing how quickly an ordinary dinner had turned into something unforgettable. Daniel Whitmore remained near the back door beside Emily Carter. From where he stood, he could see the entire group gathered along the brick wall and the narrow sidewalk behind the restaurant. It was an unusual sight. Investors, couples on dates, a family celebrating a birthday, and several restaurant staff members all standing together in the cold night air like strangers who had suddenly become part of the same story. Daniel studied Emily again. She had not stepped forward to explain anything to the crowd. She had not tried to describe what she had done or why it worked. Instead, she watched quietly, making sure everyone remained calm and together. A police siren sounded faintly somewhere in the distance, growing slowly louder as it moved through the city streets. Several guests turned their heads toward the sound with visible relief. One man near the alley entrance said softly, "Help is coming." Emily nodded slightly when she heard the siren. It was the first time Daniel had seen her show any sign that the situation was truly over. The tension in her shoulders eased just a little. Daniel crossed his arms and looked at her with growing respect. "You did not just stay calm," he said quietly. "You guided an entire room without anyone even realizing it." Emily gave a small, thoughtful smile. "People follow calm more easily than they follow orders," she replied. Daniel considered her words. In the world he came from, leadership usually meant speaking loudly, making decisions quickly, and commanding attention. What Emily had done tonight was the opposite. She had spoken softly, moved slowly, and allowed everyone else to believe they were making their own choices. Yet somehow she had led them all to safety. The distant siren grew louder now, echoing between the buildings as it approached the block. Some of the guests stepped closer together, their anxiety finally beginning to release. A few of them began thanking Emily again, their voices filled with gratitude. She accepted their thanks politely, but never lingered on the praise. Instead, she simply asked each person if they were feeling all right. Daniel watched her carefully, trying to understand the quiet strength behind her actions. After a moment, he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the kitchen hallway. "You said earlier that you have experience with situations like this," he said. "What kind of experience teaches someone to stay that calm?" Emily looked toward the end of the alley where the approaching patrol car lights were beginning to reflect faintly against the windows of nearby buildings. For a brief moment, she seemed to weigh how much she wanted to say. Then she spoke in the same quiet tone she had used all evening. Before I worked here, she said slowly, I spent several years in places where calm decisions mattered more than anything else. Daniel waited for her to continue. Emily glanced back at the group, standing safely behind them. Some people learn about pressure in boardrooms, she said. Others learn it somewhere very different. The flashing lights from the approaching patrol car finally turned the corner at the far end of the street, casting soft red and blue reflections along the alley walls. Emily watched them for a moment, then looked back at Daniel Whitmore with the same calm expression she had carried all night. In that moment, he understood something clearly. The quiet waitress who had guided an entire restaurant to safety had lived a life far more complex than anyone inside that dining room had ever imagined. The patrol car rolled slowly to a stop at the mouth of the alley, its flashing lights painting soft red and blue reflections across the brick walls and the quiet line of people gathered outside the restaurant. The sound of the siren faded, replaced by the steady hum of the engine and the distant noise of traffic moving through the city beyond the block. Two officers stepped out and began walking toward the group, their presence immediately easing the tension that had lingered in the cold night air. Guests began speaking more freely now, some explaining what had happened inside the restaurant, while others simply repeated the same sentence again and again. Everyone was safe. Everyone had made it out. Daniel Whitmore stood beside Emily Carter near the back door, watching the scene unfold with a thoughtful expression that had not left his face since the moment the tray first touched the floor inside the dining room. The officers spoke briefly with the restaurant manager and several guests, taking notes while nodding calmly. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had been fear only minutes earlier was now relief mixed with disbelief. Daniel turned toward Emily again. She had stepped slightly away from the group, standing quietly beside the alley wall with her hands folded loosely in front of her. Her posture looked exactly the same as it had during the dinner shift earlier that evening. Calm, unremarkable, almost invisible. Daniel shook his head slightly, still amazed by the contrast between her quiet appearance and what she had just done. You saved every person in that room, he said. Emily looked at him for a moment before answering. Everyone helped, she replied gently. People listened. Daniel gave a small smile. They listened because you showed them how. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The flashing patrol lights continued reflecting across the windows above the alley. Several guests were now thanking the restaurant staff again before leaving the area in small groups, heading toward the main street where taxis were beginning to stop along the curb. The strange moment that had brought them all together was slowly dissolving back into the ordinary rhythm of the city. Daniel watched Emily carefully. You said earlier that you learned to stay calm somewhere else, he said. Somewhere very different from here. Emily nodded slightly. Yes. Daniel waited, sensing that she would say more. After a moment, she continued. I spent 4 years as a combat medic in the United States Army. Daniel blinked, surprised, but suddenly understanding everything at once. The careful observation, the measured movements, the ability to guide frightened people, without raising her voice. It all fit together now. Emily noticed his reaction and gave a small shrug. After my service ended, I wanted something quieter, she said. A place where calm could still matter, even if the situation looked ordinary. Daniel looked back toward the restaurant building behind them, then at the group of guests who were now safely leaving the alley. Ordinary nights can still surprise people, he said. Emily smiled softly at that. The officers approached them briefly to ask a few final questions, and Emily answered with the same steady composure she had shown all evening. When the conversation ended, the alley had nearly emptied. The city was returning to its normal rhythm. Daniel Whitmore looked at the quiet waitress one last time before heading toward the street. In the world he knew, power usually announced itself loudly. But that night had taught him something far more important. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who never needs to raise their voice at all.